Okay, so this week I had a little more, there's been a little more going on. Obviously, we're going to talk about Shavuot and standing at Sinai and the midrashim that go along with standing at Sinai. But I want to start a little more textually based than we have in the past, because our text is our theological history, and Shavuot is all about that theological history. So depending on where you are on the spectrum in terms of thought, you may see this as actual history. You may see this as just theology and not mamish history, not real history. But I'm going to refer to it as a theological history. It is not all of our history is supported by archaeology at this time. One of the projects that Gavi was doing at the end of his semester was talking about finding a historical basis and historical proof for Abraham, of which there isn't. And I referred him to a cousin who's a professor at Hebrew University. And I remembered because Wayne said to me decades ago, we're never going to find any archaeological evidence for Abraham, because we're talking about a nomadic family living in a desert where sands constantly shift. So because we don't have a city where Abraham stays, because we don't have buildings that are built up, it's not the same as Ir David, as the city of David, which you can go and visit the archaeological site. It's not the same as looking and saying, recently a coin was found after the Syrian Greeks had conquered Israel, and then Israel had won its freedom again. And the coin mentions that this is year whatever after this redemption. So from our early years, we're not going to find a lot of factual history that we can back up with discoveries. But we have a very rich memory. We have a very rich collective memory as a people, and that's our family history. And our family history begins with Abraham, but our theological history is a little different because that begins in Egypt. Right? Before Egypt, we are a family. We're Abraham's children, and then it gets a little bigger, and we're Isaac's children, and then we end up with 12 tribes, yes, but they're Jacob's children. They're not 12 fully blown tribes. They're Jacob's children. They go down to Egypt with him. They have their children. They're an extremely large, extended family. But when we come out of Egypt, things have changed, and now we're a people. So over 3,300 years ago, we leave Egypt, and we hold this memory in our minds, and everything we do, I know I've said this before, everything we do is because of this. It informs who we are, why we do things, what is our identity. Why do we do things? Because we were slaves in Egypt, and God took us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, a strong hand and an outstretched arm. So I want to start, even though we're about to go into Shavuot, I want to start by looking back at the Haggadah. So we have a piece that we start the story with. Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Egypt. We were slaves to Egypt. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. V'yotzienu Adonai Eloheinu misham b'yad chazaka u'zro netuya. And the Lord God took us out of there with that strong hand and that outstretched arm. And we continue the whole paragraph. I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, but I want to point out what it says when we go on. It says, Hashta Avde, now we are slaves. L'shana haba'ah b'nei charim. Next year, we will be free. Right? So this is really important because we constantly read, we were slaves to Pharaoh. God brought us out. We are slaves now. Next year, we will be free. It's always we. The Torah which we're going to read, we're going to celebrate the giving of the Torah on Shavuot. The Torah speaks in the third person. But whenever we recount our history, we speak in the first person. We are slaves. We will be free. If God had not brought us out, our children and our children's children would still be slaves. So rather than focusing on our ancestors, or we could easily say our ancestors were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and God brought them out, and so we are now free. But we don't. We make everything in the first person. Now, as I said, the Torah speaks either in the third person or in the second person, because it is a conversation. So when we read Torah, it sometimes reads like a history book. This is what happened. And then the Israelites went here, and this is what happened. And then the Israelites went there, and that is what happened. And you could read any history book and find that sort of information. And so it feels that way, but it's actually a conversation. So first, we have Sinai coming in two places, both in the book of Shemot and the book of Exodus, and also in the book of Devarim and the book of Deuteronomy. And I just want to look at a couple of verses. First, in the book of Shemot, and not so much the actual receiving of the Ten Commandments. We're not going to cover that today. That's for Shavuot. But what happens before that? And why is it important that we recognize this for all of us? So in the book of Shemot, it says, V'yotze Moshe et ha'am likrat ha'Elohim, likrat ha'Elohim min ha'machaneh, v'yityatzvu b'tachtit ha'har. I want you to think about those words, tachtit ha'har. And Moshe took the people out to be closer to God from the camp, and they took their places, tachtit ha'har, which means not at the foot of the mountain, but literally under the mountain. And then later on, in the book of Devarim, it says, Atem nitzavim hayom, kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. All right, and you stand here today, all of you, before the Lord your God. And then it lists all of the people who are there. I'm not going to read it all in Hebrew, but we have your leaders, your tribes, your elders, your officers, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives. The stranger was in your midst. Then it describes what they do. So it's not just the people who you might deem important, from the hewer of wood, from the woodsman to the one who draws water, in order to enter into the covenant. Okay, so Avarecha Bivrit Adonai Elohecha. In order to enter into this covenant, everyone, every single person, the young, the old, men, women, people who did all sorts of work, everyone enters into this covenant, this brit. Velo etchem, not just you, right? Do I make this covenant? But with everyone. Let me find that verse. I actually wrote it down here, and now I just have to find it. I thought it'd be easier if I sat on the computer to find it, but of course, it's not actually easier. Ve'et asher einenu po. Okay, let's see. Ki et asher yashnu po, for all of those who are here, right here with us. So this is one of those few places where we seems to be speaking in the first person. Omed hayom, who stands here today, lifnei Adonai Eloheinu, before the Lord your God. Ve'et asher einenu po, and also those who are not here with us this day. And we're going to come back to that, because that's going to be that piece of all those who stand here right now and all those who don't stand here right now. That's going to come back to be important in a couple of minutes. And so if you've been keeping up with the count of the Omer, then congratulations, because it's not actually that easy. And we count 50 days from that second day of Pesach And if you imagine what's going on in our people's history, we're counting from the second day of Pesach, walking all the way from Egypt, and we get to Sinai and we camp there. And during this time, there have been amazing moments and difficult moments and mundane things going on, and moments of being able to see God, the cloud and the pillar of fire, and all of it comes to culminate in this shared experience we're all about to have at Sinai. And again, it's an experience that when we reenact it, we don't have a Shavuot Haggadah, although maybe we should, but when we sit down to reenact it, we then make it personal again. And we reenact it each year through a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. We're going to have these late night tikkunim. It's very interesting because I've been seeing what's available. And one of the things that's available right now, because we're all at home, is people know not everyone will want to go streaming their Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And so if you look at what's available, Sunday there was a Tikkun Leil available, and Monday I saw a Tikkun Leil available, and all of these are available through the conservative movement. The Schechter Institutes in Israel, the Masorti movement in Israel, with Masorti Olami, USCJ is doing, and the Rabbinical Assembly has both pre-recorded sessions that could be watched during this week, and they'll be doing a live streaming Tikkun Leil for Shavuot. And I know Rabbis Wernick and Friar Bodzin are both participating in that. So they're in the pre-recorded, their stuff is already on the Rabbinical Assembly website. If you are doing a Tikkun Leil, we start when Shavuot starts, which of course this time of year is late at night, and we learn all night. The idea is there was thunder and there was lightning all night while we were standing at Sinai, whether we're talking under the mountain or next to the mountain. There's thunder and there's lightning, and it's all night long, and God gives us the Torah, and we take the Torah and we spend the entire night learning because we're so excited about having it. But these tikkunim that have been happening have interestingly not started during the daytime, like a lot of classes that are available start. They've started at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, and they've gone all night. So we've been seeing things that start, even though it was Sunday, even though it was almost a week before Shavuot. It's so ingrained in us to reenact this event that happened in our lives, that even though it's not Shavuot itself, we're reenacting it in the same way, learning all night long. And it's just a very interesting piece to think about. Now, we've counted these 50 days, and we're going to have this tikkun. And I want to point out the verb tikkun. It doesn't mean learning. If you know, a tikkun leil Shavuot is learning all night on Shavuot, but tikkun comes from the verb litaken. To fix means to fix or to fashion or to secure, but it also means to make something permanent. So that means every year on Shavuot, when we learn together, we're making permanent, we're reaffirming our eternal acceptance of the Torah, of the covenant with God, and this permanent state of our people in connection with God, and more importantly, for each one of us individually. Shavuot is called Chag Matan Torah. It's the day that God gave us the Torah, and now it's our responsibility, every single one of us, to continue receiving the Torah every single year. So now I want to go back and look at some of those verses and the midrashim that could work around Shavuot and why they're important. So we have one midrash. Why were we given the Torah? And is it only the people who came out of Egypt, that 600,000, and plus whatever the mixed multitude that was left? Or is it something that we're all present doing constantly, and we are actually reaffirming something that we ourselves did over 3,300 years ago. So on the one hand, the receiving of Torah, the giving of Torah, and our acceptance of it is a culmination of God's promise to Abraham and to Sarah, to Isaac and to Rebekah, and then to Jacob, right? We were chosen for this gift of Torah, not because we're such a large population, not because of any special trait we had, but because God loved our ancestors, and therefore God loves us. We're family. So we're the ones, we're getting what was promised to our great going on, I don't know how many times, grandfather, right? We'll get Torah of this connection to God and eventually the land of Israel. But there's another midrash that teaches that God first went to the children of Esav and then to the children of Ammon and Moab, who are descendants of Lot, and then to the children of Ishmael. And as God approached every other nation in the entire world with Torah, and each nation, when God said, I have this great thing to give you, each nation said, well, what's in it? Tell me what's in it. Right? They say, always read the fine print. This is that. They wanted to read the fine print, but when God said forget about it and came to the children of Israel, this small nation of the children of Israel without question said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do it and we'll come to understand it. And so God gave us the Torah. So on the one hand, we're the first choice of God to receive Torah, to receive God's gift, because we are the children of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And on the other hand, we're absolutely the last nation in the world when everyone else has said no. So you have these two very different attitudes of what's going on. So that's kind of contradictory. Then we have more. All right. So I want to look at that Tachti Tahar, which I said to remember before, okay? And God and Moshe brings the people out to approach God from the camp where they were, which is set aside from the mountain, and brings them under the mountain. And the text, as I mentioned, doesn't say at the foot of the mountain; it says under the mountain. And there's a great piece in Talmud where Rabbi Abdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa, which is quite the name, says that this means that God actually took the mountain, lifted the mountain up, and turned it so it was over the people, and it was like a cup, and if they refused to accept the Torah, God would drop the mountain, and Sinai would be our burial site. Okay. Well, if God's holding a mountain over your head, you're not likely to say no, but we have one problem. At Sinai, we form this eternal contract. It's a covenant. It's referred to as a brit, same as brit milah, right? That's another reaffirmation of the covenant we made with God, and it's a contract. God says, if you will follow my mitzvot, then I will do this for you. Contracts have to be entered into willingly. That's why at a wedding, the Masader Kedushin, the person who is performing the wedding, will go into the bride and say, will you appoint me as your shaliach if the bride and groom aren't going to be in the room together? And there's a pulling of a handkerchief, right? So one person holds a handkerchief and the other person pulls it, because this is an action that you would never do normally. Excuse me. It's not an action that you would ever do on a normal day. And so it's clear if you're engaging in this action and it's been announced that this action was because of this purpose, you can't possibly be doing it accidentally. It is what you're supposed to be doing. You're doing it for this reason, to say, yes, I'm pulling on this to affirm that I accept it. It's also why the witnesses have to see that the bride accepts the ring, in the wedding because the groom presents the ring, so he's giving it, right? One party is giving a ring, and that's obvious. I'm handing it over, and it's placed on the bride's pointer finger because that's the easiest way to see. If it's there, there's no mistake. It's not buried somewhere on another finger. It's very obvious. And so the adim, the witnesses, have to be able to see that so that no one can say, I entered this under duress. So I tend to think that holding a mountain over your head and threatening to drop it might lead to duress. But we're still stuck with this tachtit hahar. And so I prefer a different midrash. And it's a midrash that I don't know why it doesn't get a lot of time. One reason that is the only reason I can come up with is the midrash of tachtit hahar, the mountain is hanging over the people. That one's in the Talmud. It's in Masechet Shabbat, and it says, this happened. This is what tachtit hahar means, and the Israelites responded, Na'aseh v'nishma. Now, those are two different people. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa says that God threatened them, and someone else, Rabbi Sinai, says no, it wasn't that. God offered, and the Israelites said Na'aseh v'nishma. But there's another midrash, and it's a much older midrash, and it's not anywhere in the Talmud. It's just in collections of midrashim. And I learned it from one of my teachers, Rabbi Reuven Hammer, that the mountain, yes, was held over the heads of the Israelites as they stood, but that it served instead as a chuppah for this wedding between Israel and God. Because just like we have in our life, we have brit milah, the girl, a naming ceremony for a daughter has come to be known as a brit bat, the covenant of a daughter. Bar mitzvah, you have to willingly accept, or bat mitzvah, you have to willingly accept the mitzvot upon yourself when you become a Jewish adult. A wedding, a marriage is a covenant, a brit. All of these moments in our lives, these are covenantal. So if we're going to have a covenant with God, it makes sense, and we're going to see this as this covenantal moment, and a chuppah, sometimes even at a baby naming or a bris, the child will be brought in under a chuppah, maybe the same chuppah under which the parents were married. We use that imagery for a lot of different things. And so this midrash says, no, the mountain was lifted as this magnificent chuppah for Israel and God to be married. And because of that, chuppot are often covered in flowers. Even nowadays, we see this connection, and there's a tradition of covering a chuppah in greenery or in flowers, but we don't actually have any knowledge of why. This may be the reason why. And so here we are, a marriage, and then the Torah itself, rather than just being an inheritance, the Torah becomes the ketubah, because the ketubah is something that is given from the groom to the bride in the traditional ceremony, and it becomes the bride's property, and it lays out, it's the contract that lays out all of the obligations that they have. A real ketubah, so, and I'm going to say that as a real contract, which you don't find so much in the Ashkenazi world today, because the Ashkenazi world is more of a standard ketubah text, but more ancient ones, and still in the Sephardic world today, you'll find ketubot that include exactly what each party brings to the marriage, right? If there's something valuable, a family heirloom, that can get included. I always said to Sean when we were engaged, I'm going to put in there that you have to make me breakfast on Sunday mornings. I didn't get it into our ketubah. Most of my mother told a friend of hers who had asked if she could make the ketubah, yes, and then we really had no say in the text. But that was my plan. I was going to put it in there that I had to get breakfast in bed every Sunday morning. It was never going to happen. But I was going to put it in there. So you can put things in there. So what is the Torah? It's the ketubah between God and the people Israel. Now, ketubah will say, on this day, in this place, on this year, in this year, this is what happened. And so from this family agreed to marry so from this family and brought this with them. And this is the agreement if the marriage doesn't work out. So if you think of the Torah, so first we have the presentation of the family. I mean, God is God. But all of that, Adam to Noah to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, down to Egypt, that is our family history. We have all of that. And then we go on to this moment at Sinai, and then everything that comes after this moment at Sinai, all of this becomes our obligations to each other. If you follow my mitzvot, I will be your God. And if you don't, there are consequences, just like in a ketubah. If you don't follow the rules of marriage, if you don't fulfill your obligations, the marriage will end, and then this is what happens. Ketubah lays that out. The Torah tells us what will happen if we don't do the right thing, if we don't fulfill our end of the bargain. So this is something that we reenact. This is our anniversary. Every year we're going to reenact this. We're going to reaffirm. We're going to say this is the same moment. This is, if you were born into Judaism, this is the moment that you reenact the first time you joined the covenant. If you joined the Jewish people before you became bar bat mitzvah, this is the moment you reenact that acceptance of the mitzvot upon you. And if you joined after, this moment every single year is a reenactment, is an anniversary for you to say, this is the moment when I took on all of these obligations, where I signed on to this contract, this big fat contract, and said, this is what I'm going to follow, and this is what I agreed to do. But I want to look at now in the second half of our discussion at the piece which says, who is there? Because I said a bunch of times that the Torah talks to the people Israel, but it's really not about us. The Haggadah is about us, right? The Haggadah is God took me personally out. And when there are conversations in the Torah, yes, God said this to, we say this to you and we say this to God. But for the most part, it reads, that's conversation within the text. For the most part, it reads, God did this and God did that. And sometimes God said X and sometimes Moshe said Y. And, all of these things happen. But the end of that section that I was reading earlier, V'lo etchem levadchem anochi, not only do I do this with you, koreta tabrit, not only do I form this brit with you, but, and then let me jump just a little bit before, is all of the people who are standing here. Ki et asher yishno po imanu, all the people who are standing here with us. Omed hayom lifnei Adonai Eloheinu, right before God today. Ve'et asher einenu po imanu hayom. And also, all of those people who are not here with us today. And this is a piece that I love, because the rabbis take this piece and they run with it. we go back to where I said you have to take on a covenant willingly. You have to choose to take on a covenant. Well, I wasn't born at this time. I wasn't physically at Sinai. How can I take on a covenant? How can you, God, say, this covenant, I make this covenant with you, all who are standing here today, and all who are not here? How can this covenant then be for all the generations to come? And this is that significant piece, because the rabbis look at it and they say, it's about standing. And they focus, Ho imanu omed hayom, here standing with us this day, okay, physically standing, and then the people who aren't here today. Well, if the entire people of Israel are there, if they're all standing, who would be the ones who weren't standing that day? And they say that is every Jew ever. And that's Jews who join later, that are Jews who will be born later, that are Jews who came before. We have a very interesting concept of Einenu makom, Einenu mikodem umeachar. There's no earlier later in the Torah. And the rabbis embrace this and they say, okay, there's no later, there's no earlier in our people. From Abraham to the end of the earth, every single Jewish soul was standing at Sinai together. And this becomes an idea that permeates our history. You get a book, Standing at Sinai, by Judith Plasko. You get poetry about standing at Sinai as men and as women. You have, there's a wonderful website if you're looking for a laugh. It's called bangitout.com, B-A-N-G, bang, I-T-O-U-T, bangitout.com. And they do top 10 lists, and they have, for Shavuot, I don't know if they do it every year, new top 10 pickup lines at Sinai, or top 10 Shavuot pickup lines. Like, did I see you at Sinai? We have this image, this imagery, this collective memory that is somehow injected into every Jewish brain, that we were all together at some point, that we're now connected. And yes, family is important. And you can, if you want to look, you can trace your lines back. But there's a point at which it becomes ridiculous. Who is actually family? And you have the family you choose, your friends who are like family, and you have your relatives. But once, most people, I think, would say that once you get into 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th cousins, that you're not as close with them. But Jews are a little weird. And Jews connect to each other regardless of where they are. And you can go, I was blessed to have been in Spain one year. No, I'm wrong. I was on my way to Spain, but we were in France still for Pesach. And we were invited I went with a friend, we were invited to a Seder, and this is 1981. And I look at it and I wonder, what possessed my parents? Because I was on a trip with teenagers, a school trip. What possessed my parents to let us do this? My friend Josh and I, a car pulls up in front of a hotel. Our parents, I did not grow up fully observant. I was on this trip, and our parents said our kids can't go unless they can go to a Seder. Our teacher calls the travel agent in a semi-panic, and the travel agent says, they'll just come to my house. And my teacher said, oh, great. And calls our parents, said, We have a Seder. They'll just go to the travel agent's Jewish. They'll just go to his house. Car pulls up. We get into a stranger's car. We go off to a Seder. Who thought that was a good idea? I look back on that and I think, wow, that was crazy. But it was so natural. It didn't seem crazy. If you go to the Kotel, to the wall on Friday night, there are people there who will invite you for Shabbos dinner, even though you've never met them before. And somehow it doesn't seem crazy, right? My father-in-law spent his career in the US Navy. Whenever they would pull into port, he would find the Jewish community. He would always be provided. People would argue over who would get to invite him for a meal, right? Here he was in a foreign country, but a member of the Jewish community, and that made him part of their community. And so he was always included, right? This is the way it works. And it doesn't matter where you come from, and it doesn't matter when you joined the Jewish community. Was it at birth? Was it when you were 8? Was it when you were 15? Was it when you were 50? It doesn't matter. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. And why? Because we were all standing at Sinai together. And it's a fascinating piece that says some of us come to things differently. You know, I've heard people argue against it and say it's almost insulting. And I'd love to hear your feedback. But it's insulting to say that you come to Judaism because your soul had done this 3,300 years ago, and so it's fate. But I don't think it's fate. I don't think it's fate, because there are plenty of people who leave the Jewish people. You know, we don't like to talk about them very much, but there are plenty. It happens. People convert out, people leave, they assimilate, they give up their traditions. Their children are no longer Jewish. And maybe some of them, in a generation or two, will discover this link and come back. But you never know. Jews have left the Jewish people in every generation. And other Jews have joined the people in every generation. And so it's not that being at Sinai means that you have no choice in the matter. Of course you have a choice in the matter. But being at Sinai together means that we have an innate connection. And it means that no one should ever look at another person. No one should ever look at another Jew and say, you're not part of us. No one should ever be able to say that. And it's going to sound strange, but I remember I was at a movie I must have been high school. It definitely was high school. I was at the movies, and before the movie started, and I'm sitting with a friend and talking about whatever. I have no idea what we were talking about. And I was wearing a Star of David. And someone in the row behind me asked, why are you wearing that Star of David? And that's ridiculous. And because I'm Jewish. And the answer I got was, you don't look Jewish. And I remember thinking, and that means what? Like, why is that ever a thing? That should never be a thing. There's no look. There's no Jewish look that we have to have. There's a Jewish look that the movies think we have to have. But there's no look. If you lined up my kids, my husband, and me, we have a range of skin tone that goes from very pale, Jesse's paler than I am, very pale, to coming up now into the summer, Gavi will be dark brown. We get the whole range there, right? And turns out Sean's family is Sephardic, and it turns out, weirdly, I found out that somewhere way back, some of my family members lived in Spain, and so I assume it comes from that Mediterranean side. Does one of us look more Jewish than the other? we hear all the time, right now there's a lot of discussion on the various Jewish groups. There was an article in the forward that there are fewer Jews of color than we think there are. And the response from some people was, so what? The issue with that becomes a discussion of how do we serve our community? How do we serve every single member of our community? So what does it matter what they look like? If someone isn't being served, we need to make efforts to serve them. We have to figure this out from a very basic level, and we are all together. And that's what this comes down to, because all of us who were there, whether physically standing or not physically standing there, we're clearly there, according to this text, to accept this covenant on us. And in the end, that's all that matters. Once you've accepted that covenant, it can never be taken away from you, regardless of what the Israeli political rabbinut sometimes says. And no one can tell you that you're not a Jew, you don't look like a Jew, you don't act like a Jew. No one gets to say that, because we were all standing at Sinai together. And we may observe differently, we may act differently, we may look different from each other. It doesn't matter, because a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. And this becomes the holiday when that is affirmed for everybody. And the day we eat cheesecake. So I'm gonna throw that out for questions, comments, please share. Anyone?
Well, I'll say something. A number of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking to Rav Adam, and probably everybody in this forum knows exactly who I'm talking about, Rabbi Cutler. And I said, and this wasn't an intellectual conversation. This wasn't a theological. It wasn't a social. I just sort of, it's odd, but for some reason, there's a whole lot of things here that I just feel very, very comfortable with, and I have no idea why. And let's face it, a lot of the rules can be restrictive. A lot of the I mean, whoever thought you could sit in a service for 3 hours and be quite happy at it. And all he said to me was, he said, some people have this theory, and I can't say whether I ascribe to it or not, that people like you were born with a Jewish soul. And that was the only comment he made. And that just kind of settled it for me. He said, I don't need to go farther. I don't need to define it, but there is a sense of covenant, of belonging, of this is part of who I am, and I let it go. And that's where I've gone from them. And the rest of my life continues along. And, you try and follow the rules and do everything and so on. But that part just made it simple and clear. So, and that's my 2 cents.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I got something to share. About 4 years ago, I was praying. At that time, I was a Christian. I was praying one afternoon, and then a message came over to me. You break my Shabbat. So suddenly I realized I was sinful. So I started to cry and then repent. Then the 10 commandments coming over to me one by one. I cried my eyes out and repented. It was so holy feeling that I felt I was very, very filthy. I hate myself. I feel myself disgusting because the holy feeling there compared to the holy feeling there. So I immediately said, I will keep Shabbat. God, I'm wrong, sorry. So since then I started to keep Shabbat. I never stop anyone. So it's really a covenant. I believe that true Israel will have this kind of experience. That means whether who or which nationality or which ethnicity, but whoever has this experience will will become converted into, transformed into Israel. Israel is God's creation. It's wonderful, wonderful. I cherish this. And I think that's my Mountain Sinai. I always think so, yeah. I cried for 3.5 hours that afternoon.
Wow.
Repenting, mostly repenting. Wow.
The thing is,
I cherish this very much.
I think that people who are born to Jewish parents often, or adopted by Jewish parents, often take it for granted, right? And it's always interesting to see when things hit them, those types of experiences. Because I think a lot of people do have these types of very intense emotional and religious experiences, but they're often, they hit at different times. And when something is very comfortable, so if you grew up with this, it's not always so clear to you what that means to you. But then suddenly, when you realize that there are certain choices that you're making, whether it's around the time that people get married, and even people who are intermarrying, or who are not having a fully, two Jews who are not having a fully Jewish ceremony, you suddenly end up with certain aspects that they discover inside are extremely important to them. And of course, not just Jews. I think people in general, you connect to your religion and to your spirituality that way. At these moments in your life, sometimes they come out of the blue, and sometimes they surround life cycle events. And sometimes they come because you're watching your own children, or a sibling, or parents, or whatever, and you're realizing these moments are really important, and how do I connect to them? And how I connect to them is influenced by where we belong in this world. Who are our people, whether we're talking about our people being our core group of friends and family, or our people being, in this case, greater Israel, the Jewish people. That's so important, to be able to have that feeling that you're connected spiritually and emotionally and all of that. And it's something that I think the greater Jewish people in general need more reminding of. I was talking with my daughter this morning. We're watching West Wing, the TV show from the 90s, the early 90s. And we're going through it, and I think we're in the last season. And there was a great scene in a church. And I think it was a Baptist church, and there was a lot more spirituality going on than we often see in our own services, unfortunately. And Karen said, our Baptist church is always like that. And they said, well, I can't say all of them, but often it becomes part of the culture to be able to affirm your spirituality and to be able to acknowledge it publicly. I said, and you do see it sometimes, and you might say in synagogue, if there's a sermon going on and people are nodding and they're connecting to a story the rabbi's telling, or to a particular musical piece that's being sung in prayer, and you see people having a reaction to it. But we don't, as a people, express that publicly. And I think that's much to our detriment, that we don't express that as publicly as we should. Rabbi David Wolpe, who is a rabbi in Los Angeles and an author of a number of books, he would lecture. Before he became a pulpit rabbi, he was a rabbi at the University of Judaism, which is now the American Jewish University, and he was a teacher of mine. And his brother is a classmate of mine. And he used to lecture, and Dan, his brother, who's now also Rabbi Wolpe, and I would go as students, and we'd help sell his books and do whatever. David would start He would look at a room filled, a large sanctuary filled with people, and he would say, God loves you. And he would then say, I'd like to start that way because it makes everyone in this room uncomfortable. Because Jews who grow up in Judaism are taught so much of the intellectual piece, and we are left to find that spiritual piece on our own. And it's hard. It's sometimes hard to accept it. But this is a moment, this like standing at Sinai, this should be the moment when we feel it, when we accept it, when we can connect with God. This is our, this is our emotional, spiritual wedding night. We should be able to have those experiences. So thank you so much for sharing that. Does anyone else want to add something? So I hope that everyone has some good, ice cream or cheesecake or whatever. I'll just remind people that Shavuot is the dairy holiday because it is the day we got the Torah, and within the Torah were the laws of kashrut, what animals you could eat, what animals you couldn't eat, the prohibition over consuming the blood of an animal, and so dairy became something you could easily do. Mm-hmm. It was if it's the milk of a kosher animal, you could have that. And I think that's an amazing thing because everyone should have a holiday where they eat ice cream and cheesecake and celebrate in that manner. I think with all of us home, we're going to have way too much. I'm making cheesecake. My son is making peanut butter cookies. I think we said we were making rugelach, and there is ice cream in the house, which there has been since lockdown started, which just seems to be our way of coping. So, enjoy. I hope that you all have a wonderful Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach to everybody.
If you go to merkaz.ca, that's mercaz.ca, there are, I think at last look, there were 14 different lessons that were recorded and shared there if you want to, for Shavuot. As well, I mentioned the Rabbinical Assembly is having both a pre-recorded lessons available as well as a streaming Tikkun Leil Shavuot on Shavuot. And if you go to the Merkaz, it's the Merkaz and the Canadian Foundation for Masorti Judaism Facebook page, there's also some information about USCJ and Schechter. Schechter Institutes provided some information for family activities, especially with young children. So
Terrific.
That's available on the Merkaz and Masorti Facebook page. So I wish you all Chag Sameach. Have a wonderful holiday. And I look forward to seeing all your faces next month on this screen, but also I really, really, really hope that soon in person.
Thank you. Thank you.
My grandmother would say, from your lips to God's ears.
As would my grandmother.
Even my grandmother said that.
Yes.
That's a very popular thing. All right. I'm going to end it now. Chag Sameach and be well. Stay safe.
You as well.
Okay.
Thanks very much and very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
See you. Take care. Bye-bye.